I wasn't looking for a problem with the historical record. I was looking at it the way anyone looks at a death certificate. As a primary source, the final word on who a person was. Then I looked at the line that says informant, and I started asking a different kind of question. A pre-printed form, boxes arranged in columns, name, race, birthplace, father's name, mother's maiden name, cause of death. Two people are responsible for this document: a physician who certifies the death, and an informant who certifies the life. The physician examined the body. The informant is whoever was available. Sometimes that is a spouse of 50 years. Sometimes it is a landlord, a hospital intake clerk copying from a form the deceased filled out 10 years earlier for an unrelated purpose, a neighbor who knew the surname from a mailbox. Every answer that informant provides becomes a permanent entry in the official record, sealed, filed, treated by every subsequent researcher as fact. Genealogists call the death certificate a primary source. The genealogical profession itself, in its own published standards, classifies the biographical half of the same document as secondary information, because the informant almost certainly wasn't present at the events described. Primary source, secondary information, the same document, the same box. Why does a death certificate from 1922 list a man's landlord as the authority on his parents' names and country of origin? Why did recorded suicides at a single location in England drop by 1/3 when the coroner changed, with no change in how many people actually died there? Why does a study published in 2025 find that 41% of Native Americans who died in the last decade were recorded on their official death certificates as a different race entirely? The answers are all in the document. You just have to know which line to look at. Let's go back to where the form itself came from. England, 1837. England, 1837. Parliament establishes the General Register Office, and for the first time in British history, deaths must be reported to a civil authority rather than a parish church. The motive is not history, it is not heritage. The original impetus for registration laws across England and eventually the United States was the protection of inheritance rights, determining who legally owned what after someone died. The document was built to serve property. Everything else followed from that. The system is described then and now as vital registration. The civil recording of vital events: births, marriages, deaths. The word vital implies importance, implies something essential being preserved. What it means, technically, is biological. The record exists to track the transfer of bodies and estates, not to preserve lives, to log the end of them. Before 1874, British death registration did not require a physician to examine the body. A death could be registered, officially, permanently, without any medical confirmation that the person was actually dead or that the cause listed bore any relationship to what had actually happened. For 37 years, the foundational document of civil identity recording in the English-speaking world was built on the testimony of whoever showed up at the register office and stated what they knew or believed or chose to say. In 1874, Britain recognized this as a problem. Parliament imposed a formal hierarchy for who could serve as the informant on a death registration. Someone present at the death took precedence if no such person was available. A relative present during the illness. If not that, a relative in the district. The hierarchy descended through increasingly distant contacts, but the principle was clear. Testimony had an order. The person most likely to know the truth was required to speak first. The hierarchy existed in law. It could be enforced. It created an order of testimony that the record was obligated to follow. What it also created was a documented acknowledgement, written into statute, that without that hierarchy, the wrong person would fill the form. That without legal structure, whoever was most convenient would certify whatever they believed, and the permanent record would reflect their convenience rather than the truth. Britain had been running the system for 37 years before arriving at this conclusion. The damage done to the records of those decades, deaths registered without medical confirmation, biographical details provided by whoever happened to be present, is not correctable. Those registrations stand. They are indexed. They are treated as primary sources. The United States would build its own version of this system 26 years later. It would borrow the form. It would not borrow the hierarchy. So let's follow what happened when the Bureau of the Census sat down to design the American document. Washington, 1900. The Bureau of the Census issues the first U.S. Standard Certificate of Death and requests every independent registration area to adopt it by January 1st of that year. The form divides responsibility between two signatories. A physician certifies the cause and manner of death. An informant certifies the biographical details of the life: name, age, race, birthplace, occupation, father's name, father's birthplace, mother's maiden name, mother's birthplace. The form designates specific parties as responsible for reporting vital events to the state: physicians, midwives, and undertakers. These are businesses and licensed professionals. The state maintains a registry of them. They are the authorized filers. The family is not the primary authority on the document. The business is. The informant line carries no legally enforced hierarchy, not in 1900. Not for decades afterward. Unlike Britain's 1874 reform, the United States created the informant designation without specifying who should fill it, in what order of preference, or what qualifications that person needed to have. The line exists. The requirements governing it do not. Utah adopted the system in 1905. Its registration law explicitly required undertakers to obtain biographical information and file the death certificate. The undertaker, a commercial business, becomes the administrative manager of biographical fact. The state registrar maintained a separate registry of physicians, midwives, and undertakers to ensure professional accountability. The family maintained nothing official. The family was the source the undertaker interviewed, if the undertaker chose to interview anyone, in whatever depth the undertaker found practical, at a moment when the family was managing a death. The comparison presents itself plainly. Britain ran the system without a hierarchy for 37 years, recognized the problem, and legislated a fix. The United States built the system after Britain's fix already existed and chose not to include it. The informant line was not an oversight waiting to be corrected. It was a design decision, and the decision was to leave it open. The official explanation where one is offered is that vital records are a state function. The federal government issues a recommended form. States adopt it or modify it. Each state legislature moves at its own pace, makes its own rules, determines its own standards. This is accurate. It is also a description of how 37 years of the same unaddressed problem could accumulate in one national system at the same time. What the informant line actually contained, it's in practice across the decades when most Americans' ancestors were dying and being documented, is what the form itself tells us. If you know which line to look at. Now let's look at that line directly, not in theory, in the records themselves. Pull any death certificate from before 1960. Find the box labeled Informant. The name there, and the relationship listed beside it, is the person who decided your ancestor's birthplace, their parents' names, their country of origin. This is not a supporting document. This is the primary source. Everything genealogists build from this record originates with whatever that person said, under no oath, under no legal verification standard, under no requirement to have been present at any of the events they were certifying. The genealogical profession's own published guidelines address this directly. The guidelines classify the cause of death and place of death as primary information, because the physician or coroner who certified those details was present at or near the death itself. Everything else on the certificate, birth date, birthplace, parents' names, parents' birthplaces, occupation is classified as secondary information. The informant was almost certainly not present at the birth of the deceased. They are providing these details second or even third hand, from memory, at a time of grief, to a stranger with a form. This classification appears in professional standards documents. It does not appear on the death certificate itself, where the information sits in official boxes with no such caveat attached. The informant could be anyone: a landlord, a neighbor, a hospital clerk copying from an intake form the patient completed years earlier for a completely different administrative purpose, a son who had not seen his father in 20 years, recalling dates and names from memory in an administrative office to satisfy a filing requirement before the burial could proceed. That son's best estimate of his father's birth year, his grandmother's maiden name, the village in Poland or the county in Ireland. That estimate is now sealed into the permanent record, not labeled as an estimate, not marked as secondary information, filed in the same pre-printed boxes as the physician's certified cause of death. One documented case makes the mechanics precise. A death certificate filed in 1960 lists a birth date of June 22, 1890. The informant was the deceased's son. Cross-referencing the deceased's own World War I draft card, completed by the man himself in his late 30s, shows a birth date of June 27, 1880. The son was off by 10 years about his own father's birth year. The death certificate, not the draft card, is what most genealogical databases index as the authoritative source for that birth year. The son's grief-stricken estimate now sits in the official record, unqualified. Next to the word primary, the profession knows this, its own standards say so. The gap between knowing it and acting on it, between formally classifying something as secondary and continuing to treat it as primary, is not a gap in knowledge. It is a gap in what the system is willing to acknowledge in public. And the biographical fields are only part of the problem. The other half of the certificate, the part the physician signs, has its own accounting to face. Let's track what happens when we examine the field that is supposed to be the reliable half, the cause of death. 5 choices, 1910. 1910. Public health officials add a new field to the U.S. standard certificate of death, manner of death. The field is described by its author as an American invention, added primarily to assist those who code and classify cause of death information for statistical purposes. 5 options are provided: natural, accident, suicide, homicide, undetermined. These 5 words represent the entire official vocabulary for how a human being can end. The certificate calls this field manner of death. 1 box, 1 word, no gradations, no context. No space for the circumstances that don't resolve neatly into a single category. The field is designed to produce clean data. The data it produces is clean. What it costs to produce it that way is a different question. The person who fills this box is frequently not a medical examiner. In many American jurisdictions, the official most commonly responsible for certifying deaths outside hospitals is a coroner, an elected official who is not required in most states to have any medical training. A justice of the peace carries the same certification authority in some jurisdictions. They look at a body, or at a report, or at a family's account of what happened, and they choose one of 5 words. That word, chosen by an elected official who may never have attended a single class in forensic medicine, becomes the permanent, official, legally actionable account of how your ancestor died. Medical literature documents the consequence. When a death results from the toxic effects of drugs or poisoning, and no suicide note exists, the standard practice is to classify the manner as accident. Not because the evidence rules out suicide, because there are only 5 choices, and without documented intent, accident is the available box. The 5 categories force a decision where the evidence supports ambiguity. The ambiguity disappears. The box is filled. The record stands. A coroner could be elected on a Tuesday and certifying deaths by Wednesday. No examination is required. No professional standard governs the decision-making process in any uniform way across jurisdictions. The official explanation is that local accountability serves as the check, that communities can vote out a coroner who performs poorly. What this means in practice is that the accuracy of how your ancestor's death was categorized depends on the professional standards of one elected official in one county in one year. It varies. The document does not reflect that it varies. 5 choices for the entire range of human mortality. What happens to the deaths that don't fit, the ones where the evidence points toward more than one word, where the interests of multiple parties point toward different boxes, where the truth is precisely the thing that a single word classification obscures? Let's follow what happens when one of those 5 words means the difference between a family receiving an insurance payout and receiving nothing at all. Beachy Head, a chalk headland on the English coast, rising 530 feet above the water, a place with a documented and continuous history of deaths by jumping. The deaths happened there. They were recorded. And then the number recorded as suicides dropped by 1/3 when a new coroner took office, not because the site became safer, not because the population in crisis declined, not because any investigative method changed. A different official was now choosing which of the 5 words to write in the box. 1/3 fewer suicides. Same cliff, same bodies, different coroner. Life insurance policies throughout the 19th and into the 20th century carried explicit exclusions for suicide. A death recorded as suicide nullified the payout entirely. A death recorded as accident preserved it. The death certificate, the official record, is the document insurance companies accept as determinative. The word in the manner of death box is not a neutral description. It is a financial instrument. The same death, described with a different word, has a different legal and financial outcome for the family. Physicians writing death certificates are not legally liable for errors made in good faith. A physician who writes accidental for what was a suicide cannot be prosecuted if their assessment was reasonable under the circumstances available to them. The space between deliberate falsification, a felony, and good faith error is vast. It is also unmonitored. Families knew this. Physicians knew this. The conversation between a grieving family and a physician who had treated the deceased for years, who would continue to see that family in the community, who understood what a particular classification would mean for the widow and children, that conversation left no record. The certificate reflected its outcome. The pattern was documented in San Francisco by a researcher who found that socially unacceptable causes of death were systematically misreported on California death certificates across a substantial portion of the 20th century. The 5 most commonly misreported: alcoholic cirrhosis, alcoholism, syphilis, homicide, suicide, not rare edge cases. The causes of death most connected to stigma, to insurance exclusions, to legal implications for survivors. The Royal College of Physicians of London estimated that 20% of British death certificates incorrectly list the cause of death. Published medical literature documents the error rate in the United States at between 33 and 41%, between 1 in 3 and 2 in 5. Not in the biographical fields, the ones the profession already classifies as secondary information. In the medical fields, the ones the physician signs, the ones genealogists treat as the reliable half of the document. The cause of death field is wrong between 1 in 3 and 2 in 5 times. That is the rate in the field certifiable by medical examination, sometimes confirmable by autopsy. What is the rate in the fields that record a life rather than a death? The fields filled out by whoever was available. Let's see what happens when the word in that box determines not whether a family gets paid, but whether they're safe. Longview, Texas, October 1955. A 16-year-old named John Earl Reese was shot while dancing at a cafe. The shooting was racially motivated. White men had objected to a school construction project that would benefit the black community and acted on that objection. John Earl Reese died. His death certificate listed the manner of death as accidental. Decades later, his case was documented in scholarly research on racial violence in the Jim Crow era. A road was eventually named for him. The death certificate remained what it said. The certificate calls it accidental. The evidence, documented in subsequent investigation and confirmed in the scholarship, indicates otherwise. The official record absorbed the preferred narrative of those with the most authority in that county, in that year, in that jurisdiction. The manner was logged, the box was filled, the record closed. A coroner chose a word, and the word became permanent. In the opposite direction, families of mixed or native ancestry sometimes made a different calculation with the same document. Being recorded as white on a death certificate determined inheritance rights in some states. It determined burial rights. Access to certain cemeteries certain funeral homes. In some jurisdictions, it affected the legal standing of the survivors in ways that mattered materially to their safety and economic position. The death certificate was not a passive record of identity. It was a legal instrument that assigned identity. And identity, under Jim Crow, determined what protections a family could access in the days and months after a death. Some families chose that instrument deliberately. The record reflected what kept the living safe, not what was true of the dead. A study examining racial classification on North Carolina death certificates found that funeral directors frequently recorded their own visual assessment of the decedent's race without consulting the family. The study noted that this approach tended to be accurate for black and white decedents. Because funeral home patronage was segregated, so funeral directors typically served communities whose racial identity they knew. The accuracy was substantially lower for Native American, Hispanic, and individuals of mixed heritage. The classification depended not on any biological fact or the family's knowledge of their own ancestry, but on which funeral director the family used and what that funeral director assumed when they looked at the body. The accuracy of the racial field on a death certificate in documented practice depended on the structure of funeral industry segregation in a given community. That is what the record reflects, not identity, not ancestry. The assumptions of a specific professional in a specific market in a specific year. The document designed to record who someone was became a document that determined what their family could claim. Now let's leave the individual case. Let's see what happens when the same pattern appears not in one county, not in one state, but written into the structure of the system itself. Alabama, 1908. Kentucky, 1911. Virginia, 1912. Mississippi, 1912. Tennessee, 1914. South Carolina, 1915. West Virginia, 1917. Georgia, 1919. These are the years each of these states first required death certificates. All U.S. states achieved complete systems by 1919, 19 years after the Bureau of the Census issued the standard certificate. 19 years of staggered adoption, 19 years, during which entire populations were dying and being recorded in whatever systems local officials chose to maintain or not maintain at their own discretion. The states that adopted last were the states with the largest black and indigenous populations, the populations with the fewest legal protections in the broader civil system, the populations whose vital events had been most systematically unrecorded throughout the preceding decades. Those populations entered standardized civil death registration last. This is not inference. It is the chronological record. Before a state required death certificates, deaths were recorded in church parish registers, county court books, family Bibles, or not at all. These records reflect the priorities of whoever maintained them. A black family in rural Mississippi in 1905, 8 years before that state required death certificates, had no civil authority reliably recording their vital events. Their births, their deaths, their marriages existed in whatever records local institutions chose to keep, subject to whatever decisions those institutions made about whose lives merited documentation. Without standardization, without enforcement, without any federal oversight, the recording of a life depended on where that life was lived and who was willing to write it down. The official explanation for staggered adoption is administrative and jurisdictional. States have authority over vital records. The federal government cannot mandate compliance. Each legislature acted on its own timeline. This is accurate. It describes the mechanism. It does not address what the mechanism produced. New England states had maintained town clerk vital record systems dating to the 1600s. Most had begun statewide registration of births and deaths between 1841 and 1897. The states that arrived at standardization last were not delayed by administrative complexity. They were delayed by the absence of political priority. The record reflects whose deaths the system was built to track first, and whose deaths it got around to eventually. When those communities finally entered the standardized system, when their births and deaths began appearing in official certificates filed by undertakers, certified by physicians, indexed by the state, who determined what went in the boxes? Let's track what those boxes actually measured once the system was running nationwide. Between 33 and 41% of death certificates contain errors in the cause of death field. That figure comes from published medical literature. not from critics of the system, but from researchers working within it, reviewing certificates produced by credentialed physicians following standard protocols. Medical researchers who examine large numbers of completed death certificates find a consistent pattern. Attending physicians routinely omit the true underlying cause of death and list, instead, the complications that pose the most difficult clinical problems near the end. The death certificate records what the physician found most medically notable in the final hours or days, not necessarily what initiated the sequence of events, not the origin, the last link in the chain. The U.S. autopsy rate has been declining for decades. Fewer than 10% of deaths in the United States now involve a post-mortem pathological examination. The cause of death recorded on a certificate is, in the vast majority of cases, the physician's clinical assessment, not a finding confirmed by independent examination of the body. The 33 to 41% error rate exists precisely because there is rarely an independent check. The certificate is filed, the body is buried or cremated, the record stands. Medical literature also documents where errors concentrate. They cluster around deaths involving stigmatized conditions, the same pattern found in the San Francisco research. They cluster around ambiguous circumstances where multiple possible causes are plausible, and they cluster with particular density around cases where the family's interest in a specific classification is evident to the certifying physician. The physician who has treated a patient for years, who knows the family, who will encounter them in the community. That physician is making a certification decision in a social context. The certificate reflects that context. There is a significant overrepresentation of cardiovascular diseases as the listed primary cause of death in official U.S. vital statistics, according to researchers who study the accuracy of cause of death reporting at scale. Cardiovascular events are the most clinically observable terminal events in a broad range of deaths, the final thing that happened, regardless of what initiated the process. Recording them is accurate in the narrowest possible sense. It is also in many cases incomplete in ways that matter enormously to understanding why people actually die. If the cause of death field, certifiable by medical training, occasionally confirmable by autopsy, carries a 1 in 3 to 2 in 5 error rate, the question that follows is not comfortable. What is the error rate in the biographical fields? The fields filled out not by a physician, but by an informant. The fields the profession already classifies as secondary information. Let's look at what the system did with the field. It was least equipped to get right. The race field, and what happened when researchers finally measured the damage. In 2025, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a study that linked records from the 2008 American Community Survey, which asked respondents to self-identify their race and ethnicity, with mortality data from U.S. vital statistics through 2019. The design was methodologically straightforward. Take the race each person reported for themselves while living and compare it to the race recorded on their death certificate after they died. The researchers wanted to know whether the people who died and the people recorded as dying were the same people. They were not. Official vital statistics reported that American Indian and Alaska Native individuals had a mortality rate approximately 5% higher than the national average. Official vital statistics reported a life expectancy gap between Native Americans and the national average of roughly 2 years. These are the numbers the federal government has been using to allocate health resources, design intervention programs, and assess the severity of disparities affecting indigenous populations. They appear in official reports. They are described in those reports as data, when the researchers corrected for racial misclassification. The mortality rate for Native Americans was not 5% above the national average. It was 42% above the national average. The life expectancy gap was not roughly 2 years. It was 6.5 years, 2.9 times larger than the figure in official statistics, and the gap had been growing during the study period. 4.1 years between 2008 and 2010, 8 years between 2017 and 2019. The official record showed a stable, manageable disparity. The corrected record showed a widening crisis. The mechanism is documented. Funeral directors fill out the race field on death certificates. They frequently do not ask the family. They make a visual assessment based on the appearance of the body. For Native Americans, particularly those living in urban areas rather than on reservations, those who had attained higher levels of education, those who identified as mixed race, those visual assessments were wrong 41% of the time. More than 6 in 10 individuals who identified as mixed Native American had their race incorrectly recorded. The funeral director looked at the body and wrote a word in the box. That word is now in the permanent record. It is in the official statistics. Policy decisions have been made from it. The researchers who produced this study gave the phenomenon a name: statistical erasure. The people died. The deaths were recorded. But the recorded deaths belonged to someone else, to the racial category the funeral director assigned based on appearance in a few seconds without asking the family. This is not historical. The study covers 25 years of American death registration. It covers deaths that occurred between 2008 and 2019, digital registration systems, standardized forms, decades of professional training, and still 41%. Let's go back further. Let's find where this pattern has roots that predate the modern registration system entirely. Paper genocide. The term comes from indigenous advocacy scholarship and academic research into the relationship between official records and indigenous survival. It refers to the deliberate destruction or falsification of statistical records pertaining to a specific group, with the intent to create the appearance, in the official record, that the group has diminished or disappeared beyond political relevance. White settlers in colonial America consistently undercounted indigenous people in their earliest censuses of the continent. The official characterization of this undercounting, where it is addressed at all, is methodological, incomplete enumeration, difficult terrain, mobile populations resistant to systematic counting. The record calls it a limitation of early data collection. The pattern is too consistent to be methodological. European contact brought the population of the Americas into colonial record keeping at the precise historical moment when land seizure, treaty negotiation, and resource allocation depended on population counts. A smaller recorded population justified smaller land claims, smaller treaty obligations, smaller acknowledgments of indigenous presence and rights. The undercounting served a purpose. It served that purpose consistently, across centuries, across agencies, across record types. The record reflects what the record was built to show. Death certificates participated in this pattern in specific, documented ways. In Michigan, cancer case counts misclassify more than 50% of Native American individuals. Recorded as another racial category in the surveillance data that determines research funding, treatment availability, and public health priorities. In North Carolina, a study of occupational fatality records found discrepancies between death certificates and medical examiner records in the race and ethnicity fields. In that study, funeral directors reported making their own racial assessments frequently without consulting next of kin. This is not a regional anomaly. The pattern appears wherever a box requires a race classification, and whoever fills the box makes a visual assumption rather than asking the family. Researchers studying this phenomenon have noted that the misclassification is not random. It trends in a specific direction. Native Americans recorded as white. The direction of the error consistently toward the majority category, consistently away from the minority identity. Regardless is itself data. A random error would distribute in both directions. This one does not. The term statistical erasure, coined by the JAMA researchers in 2025, describes a contemporary phenomenon measured with contemporary tools. Paper genocide describes the same mechanism operating across centuries of colonial administration. The researchers coined a new term. The pattern it names is not new. Let's follow those errors once they leave the original document, or into the system designed to hold them permanently. A death certificate can be corrected. Every state has a process. It requires a certified copy of the original certificate, supporting documentation that contradicts the specific error, a written explanation of the discrepancy, a filing fee, and submission to the appropriate state or county vital records office. The supporting documentation must meet evidentiary standards. A family member's statement that the recorded information is wrong is not sufficient. A document is required, an original record that establishes the correct information with independent authority. The official term for this process is amendment, not correction. The original certificate is not modified. It is not destroyed. Both the original and the amended version exist in the permanent record. The amendment is noted. The original entry is preserved alongside it. Vital records offices describe this practice as maintaining the integrity of the historical record. Most families do not have the documentation required to file an amendment. A family attempting to correct a racial misclassification on a 1935 death certificate must produce original documents that establish the correct racial identity. At a time when many of the original documents that might establish that identity were themselves subject to the same misclassification problem from the same era. Church records, census entries, other vital records from the same period and region. To correct one record using this process, you need another record. If both records carry the same error, if the misclassification ran through the entire documentation system for a community over multiple decades, the error cannot be corrected through the official process. The circle closes. The JAMA researchers addressed this directly. They recommended as a corrective measure training funeral directors to collect accurate race and ethnicity data from next of kin. The recommendation exists because amending individual certificates after the fact is not a scalable solution. 41% misclassification across 11 years of American deaths represents hundreds of thousands of individual certificates. Correcting them one by one through the amendment process with the documentation requirements currently in place is not realistic. The official response to the scale of the problem is to improve future practice. The existing record remains. The original erroneous entry is preserved even when the amendment is filed. The system was designed this way. The correction process was designed to require documentation that may not exist. The restriction periods, governing how long after a death the certificate is sealed from general access, were designed to last longer than most of the people who could have spoken to the original error. Whether these design choices were individually deliberate is a question the record does not answer. The cumulative effect is not ambiguous. Errors are permanent by default. Corrections are possible in theory and scarce in practice. The original entry outlasts the people who knew it was wrong. So let's follow where those permanent errors go, not into filing cabinets, into something with a much longer reach. Genealogical databases have digitized and indexed vital records at a scale that would have been unimaginable to the undertakers and physicians who filed the original certificates. Ancestry.com and Family Search are among the largest repositories of genealogical records ever assembled, platforms used by family historians across the world, containing death certificates, census records, military registrations, and immigration documents indexed in searchable databases. Both platforms use algorithmic systems to suggest connections between records across different sources. A hint is generated. A potential match is presented. The user reviews it and confirms or declines. When a user confirms a hint, the connection is incorporated into their family tree and becomes available to other researchers as a potential source. When another researcher building a different branch of the same family encounters the same tree and accepts a hint connecting their records to it, the information propagates again. Each confirmation reinforces the entry. Each entry appears to be independently corroborated by the number of trees that contain it. A name misspelled in grief by a son who had not seen his father in 20 years, in an administrative office, at the moment when a burial needed to be arranged, is now a searchable database entry. The misspelling is indexed alongside the correct spelling from other sources. When a new researcher searches for the name, both entries appear. The death certificate entry filed officially by a credentialed undertaker carrying the word primary is algorithmically indistinguishable from an entry filled with accurate information by someone who knew the deceased for 50 years. Experienced genealogists document this specifically. An image misidentified on one platform was reposted across multiple family trees over a period of time, distributed in printed form to family members, treated as confirmed by the sheer volume of appearances. Before anyone verified the identification, the error had been accepted into enough independent trees that each new researcher encountering it found what appeared to be multiple independent confirmations. Each confirmation was of the same original mistake. The trees had no mechanism to know that. The algorithm counted confirmations, not accuracy. In the paper era, an error sealed in a county courthouse filing cabinet affected one researcher at a time. The physical barrier, geography, access requirements, filing fees, limited the propagation. The error was contained by inconvenience. In a digital system with algorithmic suggestions and shared tree infrastructure, one error filed in 1922 can appear in thousands of family trees within years of digitization. The containment is gone. The errors are not. Let's go back to the deliberate ones, the ones that weren't made in grief or haste, but in knowledge of exactly what they were doing and why. Some states, at a specific point in the late 20th century, removed the cause of death field from publicly accessible death certificates. The official rationale was privacy protection, preventing the misuse of sensitive medical information about recently deceased individuals. The practical result was a death certificate that was simultaneously more official, still legally required and state-filed, and less informative. A document with a field removed to protect what that field had been recording. The field had been recording pneumonia, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Through the 1980s and into the 90s, pneumonia appeared with notable frequency as the listed immediate cause of death for men in specific age ranges in specific urban centers. The deaths clustered. The recorded cause did not cluster with them, not in the official record, where each appeared as an individual pneumonia death, unrelated, unremarkable, the kind of respiratory death that has always appeared in vital statistics. A physician recording pneumocystis carinii pneumonia as the immediate cause of death for a patient who died of AIDS-related pneumonia has written something that is medically accurate in the narrowest possible sense. The pneumonia was real. It was the immediate cause, the underlying condition, the one that made that pneumonia lethal, that explained why this man in his 30s died of a respiratory infection, could be omitted, legally, under the good faith standard. By a physician who had treated this patient for years, who knew the family, who understood what an AIDS diagnosis in the 80s meant for the survivors navigating insurance claims, employers, landlords, and communities that were responding to the epidemic with fear. The concealment served multiple interests simultaneously. It protected families from social stigma attached to the diagnosis. It protected estates from discrimination in insurance and legal proceedings. And it produced official mortality statistics that systematically understated the scale of the epidemic in its early years, obscuring the public health emergency that required a response at precisely the moment when the response was most urgently needed. The same word, pneumonia, written in the cause of death box in good faith by physicians who understood its implications, served individual families, and distorted collective knowledge at the same time. The state response was not to improve accuracy. Some states removed the field from public access entirely. The solution to a record being systematically used to conceal a condition was to make the record less transparent. The cause of death field was redacted in the name of protecting the information it contained from misuse. The problem of inaccuracy was addressed with opacity. The document became more restricted and less complete, both simultaneously. That is the record of what happened. Let's look at the structure that makes all of this not just possible, but permanent. In most U.S. states, certified copies of death certificates are restricted for a period after the death. The restriction period varies. 25 years in some states, 50 years in others, with significant variation in what counts as sufficient relationship to the deceased to receive access during that period. The restriction is described in state vital records law as privacy protection, preventing the misuse of information about recently deceased individuals by parties without legitimate interest in that information. The people with the most direct knowledge of the deceased, who knew the informant, knew the family, could identify an error in the birthplace field or the parents' names or the race classification, are most available to correct the record in the years immediately following the death. Those are the years during which the record is restricted. By the time the restriction lifts and general research access opens, the people who could have spoken to the accuracy of what the informant reported are frequently themselves dead. A certificate filed in 1965 in a state with a 50-year restriction became available for general research in 2015. The informant who filled out the biographical fields in 1965 is not available to be questioned in 2015. The error they may have introduced cannot be interrogated. The permanent record has outlasted the living memory that could have corrected it. The mechanism was made explicit in a documented policy debate in Quebec over how physicians should complete death certificates for patients who died under the province's end-of-life care law. The Quebec College of Physicians considered recommending that physicians who administered euthanasia should record the cause of death as the patient's underlying medical condition, not the drugs that were actually administered. The rationale given was specific: to protect families who did not know their relative had chosen this form of death from discovering it through a public record. The practice guide for Quebec physicians who administered euthanasia under that law instructed them to record the underlying medical condition as the cause of death. This is not the decision of an individual physician acting under personal pressure in a difficult moment. This is institutional instruction, written into a practice guide, adopted by a professional body. A death certificate officially designed by policy to record something other than what caused the death. The rationale is family protection. The mechanism is falsification. Both are simultaneously true and simultaneously official. A document whose errors cannot be challenged by those who know they are wrong, whose restriction period outlasts the living memory that could verify them, and which in some jurisdictions is officially instructed to record something other than what occurred. The record accommodates this. The record was designed to accommodate this. Let me be precise about what we're examining here. Between 1837 and 1919, the English-speaking world built a civil system for recording the deaths of its citizens. In the United States, this system delegated the certification of biographical identity to whoever was administratively available at the moment of death: an undertaker, a physician, a neighbor, a hospital clerk. No legally enforced hierarchy determined who that person should be or what they needed to know about the life they were certifying. Britain had built that hierarchy into law in 1874. The United States built its system 26 years later and chose not to include it. The resulting document is called a primary source. It is the foundational record of genealogical research. It is treated by databases used by millions of researchers as the authoritative account of who a person was, where they came from, and who their parents were. The same profession that calls it a primary source formally classifies its biographical content as secondary information in its own published standards. The cause of death field carries a documented error rate of between 33 and 41%. The race field misclassifies 41% of Native Americans. In the most recent period studied, covering 25 years of American deaths published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, suicide has been systematically recorded as accident across 2 centuries of American death registration because insurance companies used the word suicide to deny payouts, and physicians were not liable for good faith reclassification. Some states removed the cause of death field from public records entirely rather than address the accuracy problem. Some jurisdictions have officially instructed physicians to record something other than the actual cause. The correction process requires documentation that in many cases cannot exist. The restriction periods are long enough to outlast the people who could have corrected what they personally witnessed being recorded incorrectly. The evidence for all of this is not speculative. The JAMA study is published and peer-reviewed. The error rates come from medical literature. The good faith liability standard is written into law. The genealogical profession's classification of death certificate biographical data as secondary information appears in its own formal standards. The Quebec policy guidance was documented and debated in published scholarship. The Jim Crow racial violence cases are part of the historical record. The conventional account asks us to accept that all of this is the accumulated result of individual limitations: grief-impaired memories, undertakers making reasonable assumptions, physicians exercising professional judgment in difficult circumstances, legislators moving at their own pace, that the absence of an informant hierarchy was an administrative oversight correctable at any time, but never corrected. That the systematic racial misclassification of Native Americans for decades is a training problem that better workshops will resolve. That the restriction periods that reliably outlast living memory were calibrated for privacy rather than for permanence. How many structural features point in the same direction before we're obligated to ask about the direction? The document still exists. The informant line is still there. So let's examine it. The death certificate for your ancestor is likely accessible right now. Ancestry.com. Family search. A state vital records office, a county courthouse. The document exists. Pull it up. Find the box labeled Informant. Look at the name there and the relationship listed beside it. Ask yourself whether that person was present at your ancestor's birth, whether they knew the family's actual country of origin, the correct spelling of the surname in its original language, the village rather than the province rather than the country, whether they had any specific basis for the birth year they wrote in the box, or whether they were estimating at a moment of grief in an administrative office because the burial could not proceed until the form was filed. Then look at how many family trees, across how many platforms, have accepted that box's contents without that question. How many branches of how many families have been extended from that birth year, that birthplace, those parents' names? Secondary information elevated to primary status by the weight of official print and the authority of a pre-printed box. The death certificate was not designed to preserve your ancestor's identity. It was designed to close an administrative file. The identity recorded on it reflects the knowledge and the interests of whoever was standing in the Undertaker's office at the right moment. Sometimes that was a devoted spouse of 50 years with complete and accurate knowledge of the family history. Sometimes it was a landlord who knew the surname from a mailbox. In some documented cases, it was a funeral director making a visual judgment about race without consulting the family, a judgment that turned out to be wrong 41% of the time. In a study covering a decade of deaths, reviewed by the Journal of the American Medical Association and described by its own authors as statistical erasure. What did we receive? A document called a primary source that its own profession classifies as secondary, a racial field that misidentifies 4 in 10 Native Americans, a cause of death field, with a 1 in 3 error rate, a system whose correction process requires documentation that often cannot exist, whose restriction periods outlast living memory, and which in some jurisdictions officially records something other than what happened. We have been building family histories on this, connecting names to names, generations to generations, using a document whose structural weaknesses were designed in and have never been designed out. We didn't inherit our ancestors. We inherited someone's account of them. Someone who may have guessed, someone who may have had reasons to guess in a particular direction, someone whose name is right there in the box if you know to look. Look at the informant line. Do you know who that person was? Do you know what they knew? And if the answer is no, what else in the record you've been trusting don't you know? Not just about your family, about every family whose history was certified by whoever was available, filed by whoever was credentialed, and handed down as fact to anyone who thought to look.